I'm Elaine O'Neill. I'm a research associate with the School of Forest Resources, College of Environment, University of Washington. I'm also the executive director of Quorum, which is the Consortium for Research on Renewable Industrial Materials. We've been looking at the science of wood and energy in wood for the past 13 years. I looked at the mountain pine beetle impacts in eastern Washington, and what was really interesting for me is I expected to find a role of high density over maturity. And what I really found was a very, very strong climate signal starting at about 2000, where basically the mortality that we were seeing, which was tenfold what the average for the 20 prior years, was completely associated with hotter and drier summers. Now this is different than what they found in British Columbia. That was warmer winters. That was a range shift. What we were seeing was actually the trees were in a dynamic situation with the bark beetles, and they were overcome by these hotter and drier summers. Well, the first of the so whats would be this idea that mountain pine beetle is a native insect. The fact that forests get old and are attacked by bark beetle is something we've known and studied for well over 30 years. The difference between what we're seeing now and our prior history is the magnitude of the impact. We basically have massive bark beetle outbreaks in the entire western U.S. and Canada, as the entire extent of the susceptible pines are being affected. And now in recent years, they're talking about it moving across the boreal forest. Those things we can say are uncharacteristic and consistent with the idea that climate change is amplifying an existing condition or an existing situation and making it worse. In this case, tipping the balance in favor of the insect over the tree, and we have these massive mortality events. Millions and millions of acres. One of the things that we looked at, and this was shortly in 2006, we had what was called the tripod complex fire in northeastern Washington. I can't recall the exact perimeter. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 350,000 acres in the perimeter. Now, not everything burned within that perimeter. And in the prior several years, I had actually done the analysis of the location of a massive mountain pine beetle outbreak in that area. That was where most of the outbreak had occurred in the prior 5 years. And it turned out that 69 out of 100 plots, which are national census plots, they're on a grid, were heavily infested with mountain pine beetle in that area. Now, talking to people on the fire line, those are the areas that burnt the hottest. We had the most damage. That's not a surprise. The wood was drier. Burned hotter, was harder to control. Now that's also part of the natural system. The question you have to ask is it going to create regeneration difficulty? Maybe, maybe not. Some areas it is, some areas it isn't. Is that an impact in terms of the amount of carbon emissions that are currently occurring with these wildfires across the West? Whether or not we want to look at methods or ways to reduce that impact in terms of our carbon footprint. A lot of the outbreaks are occurring on federal lands, but then a lot of the pine stands are on federal lands. Proportionately, I don't have a number for you in terms of the amount of effect. I mean, the beetle doesn't respect boundary of public versus private. It will go where the trees are available and vulnerable. Now, on private lands, there's opportunity to be fairly aggressive in terms of risk reduction, taking out the infested trees, lowering the densities, and they can do that in a fairly proactive way if there's an impact, or reactive way, I should say, if there's an impact, proactive way to try to prevent an impact. And we're seeing that. There's ample evidence out there of organizations or companies or counties that are able to thin and reduce that impact. It's a little bit more difficult on federal lands. just in terms of the number of plans and the timelines for actually being able to accomplish anything once there's an insect outbreak. The trees don't remain merchantable for long after you have an outbreak. I was asked to testify to the subcommittee of the Energy and Natural Resources, the Senate subcommittee for the Energy and Natural Resources, to look to discuss this issue of how to manage national forests in face of climate change, including adaptation and carbon storage. And you know, the broad part of that was really to highlight how insects and disease and fire are really affecting our ability in the West, the dry West, to be able to store carbon in the woods. It's a very high risk, and that's my take-home message with that. It's a very high-risk place to store carbon. Now, but then the question of, well, if we remove the carbon, how much do we remove, and what do we do with it, and how is that going to be beneficial in terms of a climate change impact? I think we address in some work that we've been doing in terms of life cycle inventory, life cycle assessment of wood products. And what we're finding is that when you remove materials from the forest and you put them into long-lived products, so we're talking solid wood products that are going to go into a building, they're going to stay there for a period of time, that you're actually increasing the amount that an acre of land can sequester and store, because you're removing some of that material gets stored elsewhere, and then that frees up the land to grow more.